So this is the second time that I have the honor of sharing my thoughts about Chip's work in front of Chip, with Chip in the room. First was at a conference which was held in the honor of his 70th birthday at the University of Maryland, where I presented a paper, nervously presented a paper on trouble on Triton, which was an early version of what then turned into a chapter in my book. But what I enjoy and what keeps me coming back to Chip's science fiction novels is his playful approach to human beingness, or just beingness, because right, not all of his characters are quite human, not always quite human. His work begins with the assumption that there is no fixed norm, that there's no true universal form. At least this is what I experience. That there are no biologically determined mandates, or at least no permanent ones. And most importantly, that his characters are perfectly at home in a world of play and exploration of the self and the body. And there's a plethora of ways that the characters inhabit bodies in his science fiction, from those whose bodies are augmented, like the four-armed character Snake in his very first novel, Jewels of Actor, to those with special physical and psychic abilities, characters with telepathic and other visionary or sensory powers. There are characters who self-modify their bodies. I write about those in Babel 17 as well as in Triton. And these actually predate the modified bodies that we found later in the 1980s cyberpunk, namely the work of William Gibson, Neil Stephenson, Bruce Sterling. And there are also characters without bodies, the entities in The Fall of the Towers or the species in Einstein Intersection. And there are people who are dead, like the discorporate in Babel 17. But as well as bodies, these science fiction books also offer us ways to think about subjectivity and personhood. Rather than being organized around what we are essentially, like this idea that we're essential something, we can think of ourselves as self-organized around what we feel, what we like, what we desire. These books help us think about desire differently, naming that it need not be a truth-telling, a hard kernel at the center of us, but rather it can be understood as a vast field of play. So I'd like to read two sections from my book, two brief sections. The first from chapter 4, which is called Utopia Without the Human, and chapter 5, which is called In the Realm of the Senses, which is about Triton, and the 19th century socialist utopian thinker Charles Fourier, right? But just a caveat that the way I use utopia is not to be confused with the idea of a blueprint for a society or a totalizing plan for everything. I take it, as the critic Jose Munoz did, as a practice or a doing or an energy, a tendency to dissent from the dominating power structures that would govern our lives. So I'll just read here a short segment from chapter 4. Throughout his science fiction, Samuel R. Delany explores the malleability of biological matter and frees it from normative determination. His humans enjoy an infinite number of predilections and pleasures and practice myriad forms of relationality and bodily expression. His fiction foregrounds the sensorium. Smell, touch, and sound are as important to the texture of the world as is sight. His science fiction novels, Babel 17 and Einstein Intersection, published in 1966 and 1967 respectively, experiment with the idea of the human, playing with notions of biological species, sentience, and the concept of subjectivity. As well as embodiment and sensation, Delany's fiction considers language, including how it works, how we use it, and the complex discursive systems of self-representation. The novel, who is this animal man? Asks the general at the beginning of Babel 17. The novel plays with this inquiry and ostensibly makes the assumption that the species, as at its base, is defined by the use of language. It also seems to be affirming the idea that subjectivity, the ability to reference the self, is based in this language use. An entity needs to be situated around a core sense of being before it can communicate. Yet, even as it seems to be making these claims, it imagines different forms of communication and ways of conjoining, out of which selfhood is developed. that there is no me without you, right? That you is a being singular plural. So I think I'll talk a little bit about Babel 17, but I'll try no spoiler. I'll try not to have a spoiler, but I talk a little bit about what it's doing in this fabulous book. Set in space, the novel's central character is Rydra Wong, poet, telepath, and codebreaker, out to solve the mystery of a disruptive radio transmission accompanying acts of sabotage against an entity called the Alliance. Through her augmented abilities, Rydra deduces that the transmissions are not a code, but a language, which she names Babel 17. To find out who speaks the language, she assembles a starship and crew to chase it down. To recruit her crew, Rydra visits the rowdy heterotopia of Transport Town with a reluctant customs officer in tow. Here, stellar men and roustabouts drink, fight, and carouse. Transport Town is heterotopian in two senses of the word. Heterotopia refers to a kind of enclave where dominant rules and regulations don't apply. Of course, that's a simplification, but also as a medical term referring to skin grafting, the coexistence of one tissue type with another. The town is filled with humans who have modified their bodies in a variety of ways. Here, biological lability is not in the name of supporting a norm or a regularized idea of superiority, as it is in the dreams of eugenicists. I talk about H.G. Wells and Julian Huxley in this chapter as such. Instead, cosmetosurgery, as it is called in the book, affirms a heterogeneity of imagined fleshly formations. Rydra and the officer are greeted at the door of a basement cafe by an ebony-skinned man with red and green jewels set in his chest, face, arms, and thighs, filed teeth, and pointed ears. In the bar, there are amphibian or reptile creatures, griffins, and metallic-skinned sphinxes. Rydra hires a captain for her ship named Brass. He has modified himself into a leonine beast. The body modifications are not primarily for work. Play and aesthetic pleasure are the ethos for such body modification. He plays with the lines between animal and plant, the living and the dead, and the heteronormative or homonormative notions of the couple. A typical ship's crew consists of a range of entities, including a navigating triad called ears, eyes, and nose, and inseparable tripling who are sexually, emotionally, and sensorially connected to each other. Let's see, what am I doing now? So that's my little chunk from chapter 4. From chapter 5, this is the chapter on Triton. Imagining who we are when humans are decentered and denatured is difficult. What then would be the basis of subjectivity? Questioning liberal humanism's individualist politics in the search for a new sense of collectivity means to face a tension between exploring alternative forms of subjectivity and creating the good life. Utopia, in a humanist sense, is about creating a world without want based in the fulfillment of people's needs and desires. Locating these needs and desires would seem to require an autonomous subject, human fulfillment necessarily dependent on sovereignty over the self. But can the subject ever be unified, knowing, and autonomous? Do our desires make us whole and stable entities? Are they truth-telling, or are they culturally and politically constructed? Can we articulate desires outside of established circuits of knowledge? Is selfhood predicated on this articulation? These are the questions I explore in Trouble on Triton, subtitled An Ambiguous Heterotopia. During the course of my research, I actually discovered this early 19th century social utopianist named Charles Fourier, and got very excited because his ideas of utopia is based in the idea that all of people's passions and predilections must be fulfilled with an emphasis on the physical senses. There must be, as he insists, a minimum of taste and touch. And there's a suppressed volume called Nouvel Amoureux, which was suppressed by the people who were interested in him for his phalanxes, which outlines his sexual universe. And it's full of saphists and sodomites, flagellants and the like, who are the most enlightened and the closest to realizing what he calls harmony. It's a great read. Um, but Fourier's world making project, with its endless charts and taxonomies, seems just the type of planned utopia Delany would reject. Yes, third person. In Triton, Delany satirizes such blueprint utopias by constructing Triton society as based in an absurdly endless labyrinth of types and categories of gender and sexuality. Delany writes, it's only by problematizing the utopian notion, by rendering its hard perimeters somehow permeable, even undecidable, that you can make it yield anything interesting. Delany explains that could never detail the world of Triton completely, for any socio-political structure must remain supple, open to change and experimentation, and its boundaries porous. A totalizing plan for social engineering can never account for the shifting quality, the permeability of people's propensities and their gratification. I won't spoil the plot, but it had me think about the relationship between desire, discourse, and subjectivity, how desire and its fulfillment both form and diffuse the individual self. Letting our desire loose, I propose, allows for the self to be in motion, in transformation, in becoming. Desire refuses discourse, even as it causes it to proliferate. Either way, it disrupts any ordered sense of the self, but desires also form the self. Sensations give us a soft, shadow-like shape. Perhaps fulfillment needn't rely on ourselves as bounded so, like a brick. Perhaps we can imagine a calm opacity of meaning to ourselves, a softly binding flux and filigree of our desires. There. Thank you. I got through it. Okay, so I believe we have Tavia next, yes?
I think I am on. Yes, is this thing on? Can people hear me?
Yes.
Great. Um, that was wonderful. I'm so honored to be on this panel with these luminaries, and I am intimidated as much as Jayna to be speaking about Samuel Delany's work in front of him. I was also at that conference at the University of Maryland, and I also, I guess, just before I jump into things, say that listening to you read just now, Jayna, I'm thinking about all the ways in which we have just been like partners in crime forever. This is like one of those rare occasions where our joint presence on a Zoom call proves that we're two different people.
Yeah, right. I know. We've been joint for a while, yeah.
uh, Joined at the hip. And to John, I had the real pleasure of meeting John Keene a couple of years back, and I taught his wonderful book Counter Narratives. It helped shape my grad seminar last. God, when was that? Last fall. Yes, in the middle of COVID. Counter Narratives help us think through so many things having to do with Blackness and the aesthetic. But today I'm going to focus my 8 minutes on themes similar to Jayna's, and to give you a little bit of a taste of my reading of the Einstein Intersection from my book, Afrofabulations, the queer drama of Black life. So in my work as a critic, I look to Delany as a grandmaster of science fiction, of course, but also as a profound theorist of alterity and difference. Again, as Jayna was suggesting, and I guess I should say for me, because theory, it's often, what does that mean? To me, theory is just a way of estranging reality. And so it's actually much closer to fiction, especially to speculative fiction, than one might think, right? And that the work that theory at its best is it estranges reality not for its own sake, but in order to find ways of making reality more habitable, perhaps more utopian, um, um, for those of us who experience it as um, as inhospitable in the ways um, that so many of us do. So science fiction has long been a place to tell different stories, but also to tell stories of difference. You know, the differences of race, gender, sexuality, and the human. And this has been something that is important to underline because there is both a tendency to sort of take or assume that SF is a kind of boys club, or it's predominantly um, about or exclusively about cis white male subjects, but also that science fiction and speculative fiction is a form of escapism, right? And that in a certain way, the way we talk about it or don't talk about it in the academy up until relatively recently, that neglect comes out of that sense that, in contrast to other, let's call it mundane fiction, right? There's something escapist about what SF narratives do. And, I think, and, Delany certainly can, chime in on this, but one of the things that I've always gained from his writing, both as a novelist and as a critic and theorist, and I'll talk primarily about the novel today, but um, that SF writers like Samuel Delany have had to theorize their work in part because others wouldn't, right? And that's actually not a bad thing, right? That SF has a really robust organic intellectual function, right? And SF fans are highly informed. You look at the universe of SF, um, the internet culture of conversation and discussion. I mean, I'm telling things to an audience that presumably already knows, right? So, but as science fiction and fantasy have grown into the culturally dominant form of mass entertainment that they are today, um, or even as has happened, or maybe especially as it has happened, I think it's important to continue to think about its marginal origins and its status as what Delany calls para-literary, right? It's like um, somehow outside or alongside the dominant form of fiction, of narrative, and the excerpt from my book, which is the chapter is titled "The Fabulous Formless Darkness," is in engagement with that. So my chapter briefly makes an argument about how contemporary queer and trans politics could learn from some of the capacious ways that Delany was exploring desire, embodiment, and metamorphosis beginning in the 1960s. Now, the Einstein intersection, I'll hold it up again because I like visual aids, was originally entitled A Fabulous Formless Darkness. And that gave me the title for my chapter. And it's also a title I love. I have this fantasy that perhaps it will be republished one day with that title. It doesn't necessarily have to come true for me to want it to be true. It might be a form of fan fiction or fan fantasy. But what I like about the title of Fabulous Formless Darkness is that it connotes the infinity of outer space, which gives us our title today, the Black universe, right? The Black universe out of which life emerges, right? But it also powerfully suggests fabulation in the sense that the French philosopher Henri Bergson gave the term. And another translation of Bergson's term is the myth-making function, right? So fabulation as the myth-making function is really at the center of what the Einstein intersection is doing, and indeed what many of his Delany's early novels are. So science SF writers are fabulists in the Bergson sense, in that they appeal to the virtual, right? The virtual not as that which does not exist, but that which sort of makes continual contact with the real in excess of the real, right? And the myth making function, traditionally we can often suspect myth, particularly in modernity, right? We associate myth with mass deception, with superstition, with ideology, etc. And I think that's all important and true, right? I mean, myths are dangerous, right? But what's interesting about myth making, the myth making function, is the creation of myths, right? The way in which creativity can, to quote a poet that I know Delany loves, Hart Crane, lend a new myth to God, right? So what does it mean to lend a new myth through the act of creation, whether we're talking about poetics, whether we're talking about narrative, or um, indeed other forms of creativity? The last thing I'll say before I jump into the excerpt is it is the Einstein Intersection is a post-apocalyptic novel. I guess you could, yeah. I mean, um, it's long after the post-apocalypse, after the apocalypse, right? It's sort of set in the future, and but what's interesting about that is that we focus so much on the end of the world today and climate collapse, and our politics are so organized around this sense of no future that we sometimes forget how fundamental the apocalypse is to human culture and has been for like at least the last 2 millennia, right? In different waves and in different aspects, right? But the particular moment that the Einstein intersection comes out of invites us to consider both the end of the world through nuclear holocaust, but then the survival of a certain kind of human mythos, right? Including the myth of race, um, and its metamorphosis in an alien and post-human future. So that's something I think to think about and to think with as we encounter this novel, half a century on. So, despite its elegance and relative brevity, the Einstein intersection is challenging to summarize. The protagonist, Lobi, is a youthful musician and member of an alien race that has fallen to Earth several millennia after the extinction of humanity in a nuclear holocaust. And these narratives of sort of life falling to Earth, I think, as I looked it up, it's called the Myth of Panspermia. I love that word. So this is a panspermia tale. In search of terrestrial corporeal form, these aliens have reanimated the human genome, and with it, shards of our mythopoetic cultural inheritance. The results have a Frankenstein unevenness. What the low have produced is a human species with three sexes, male, female, and neuter. All three sexes exist on a disability spectrum from functional to non-functional, and all are to various degrees reproductive with each other. As a thought experiment, Delany's world building deliberately departs from any known human culture then or now. In particular, he does not seek initially to represent or depict anti-normative, trans, queer, or disabled characters. Rather, his novel seems to engage in a rigorous working out at an almost mathematical level, or a quantum mechanical level, of the implications of a non-normative post-humanism, looking at a species attempting to consciously evolve in the direction of human norms as they perceive them. The novel contrasts these normative strivings for what Delany terms the human ratio with the great countervailing power of music, of Black music, or what he in the novel calls the great rock and the great roll. Delany presents this story in a postmodernist form that continuously signals to the reader its status as myth and fiction. Lobi occasionally directs the reader, alerting her to the metafictional form of the novel, which proceeds to throw Lobi into a series of plot-driven adventures drawn alternately from myth and religion, such as Theseus and the Minotaur, Orpheus and Eurydice, The Temptation of Jesus, contemporary Anglo-American pop culture, such as the Beatles, Billy the Kid, Jean Harlow, and pulp fiction itself, post-apocalyptic survival, eugenicism, Adventures with Dragons. Driving these dizzying adventures is Lobi's pursuit of the figure Kid Death, who has killed Lobi's beloved Frieza, and whose own death Lobi somehow surmises might bring Frieza back. Along the way toward a climactic final encounter with death, Lobi gains two additional companions, the four-armed dragon herder Spider and his silent telekinetic sidekick Green Eye. And here are some characters who in some ways actually reappear in versions and visions from other early novels, such as the Jewels of Apter. Green Eye, who may be a textual stand-in for Frieza, Eurydice, Jesus, or all three. as Lobi discovers more of the mercurial nature of these mythic beings. He journeys by dragon from his pastoral home in the country toward the metropolitan Branding-on-Sea, home to the seductive androgynous figure known as the Dove, who elicits from Lobi his most impressive musical performance of the novel. So not to give it a spoiler alert, but this sort of trend, this sort of the journey from being able to kind of listen to other people's music to this kind of climactic discovery of his like own voice, so to speak, is one of the ways of thinking about how music plays a central role in this novel. The ability to hear the music in other people's minds is highlighted in the novel as a mark of Lobi's specialness, but it is also a sign of deviance from the norm that he must learn to dissimulate and hide. Anxiety over gender and identity and sexual orientation may be muted among the low. In that sense, they're shown as progressive in relation to American culture circa 1967, but only insofar as their efforts are focused on the intergenerational achievement of normal embodiment and the exclusion or disselection of the non-functional. So again, a kind of before homonormativity, homo nationalism has been kind of conceptualized, there's already this observation in the novel that we can kind of incorporate diversity of gender and sexual orientation and still retain this desire for normality and an anxiety about those who don't fit. So the normative strivings of the low are stymied by the regular birth of disabled and nonverbal children, who they deny the honorific lo, la, or lay and keep in ominously named cages. The Einstein intersection is at once a redeployment of common tropes and myths from adventure science fiction and fantasy, and an allegory of those tropes. Delany's recently published notebooks from this period reveal a precociously homosexual and libertine young writer who is consciously working through, rather than unconsciously acting out, classic heteronormative tropes. Within the heteronormative genre codes of 60s pulp fiction, Delany was developing what Sylvia Wynter would call new genres of being human. But he is not simply optimistic about where these new genres might lead. Rather, Delany makes use of this textual scenario to speculate upon the capacity of racial, gender, and sexual differences to produce subjects who are emancipated from the myths and tropes through which social norms are transmitted and reproduced. Delany, I suggest, is interested in working out the implications of transgressive or anti-normative corporeal frameworks. If the opening gambit of the Einstein intersection is that its mutated, monstrous, and musical hero will prove more sympathetic than the damaged and damaging society from which he escapes, the vision of the novel is not entirely anti-normative, but instead fabulates heterotopic spaces and selves. This feature allows the novel to resonate anew in our contemporary moment. In the Einstein intersection, queer theory's method of problematizing norms and championing the different finds its dark precursor. The dark precursor is a term from atmospheric science, as adopted and adapted by the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze. As Deleuze claims indifference and repetition, and Deleuze was very influenced by Bergson, which is why I pair them in the longer chapter, thunderbolts explode between different intensities, but they are preceded by an invisible, imperceptible dark precursor, which determines the path in advance, but in reverse, as though intagliated. Deleuze turns to this atmospheric metaphor as a way of offering his own account of what, in the psychoanalytic tradition, is also called Nachträglichkeit, or afterwardsness. So instead of identity knowledge, we have the speculative powers of Blackness, which are non-identitarian. In this fiction, contemporary readers are positioned as the dark precursors of the low. And here I mean that as we read about these like future beings, we sort of understand our own mythos, right, as prefiguring the struggles that the low are engaged in. In intellectual history, that is today, the novel becomes the dark precursor of our contemporary queer theory. And if we place Delany's speculation in the tradition of the metaphysical thought experiment in which he is situating himself, we see how the novel is teaching us how the human and the post-human form shadows of one another. And I'll stop there.
Yeah. So First of all, thank you, Jayna and Tavia. These were wonderful presentations. And thanks for making this event happen. Chip, of course, it is an incredible honor to be here speaking on your behalf, speaking about you and your work. Many thanks to Melanie McNair and Naomi, the Center for Fiction, for hosting this event. And many thanks to everyone who came out tonight. So I'm going to speak primarily as a fiction writer who has been reading Samuel Delany's work for, well, actually now I counted over 30 years. And so I'll be engaging in a little bit of fanboying. But also I want to say to sort of think about everything I'm going to say applies to the science fiction, but I've been really sort of fascinated about Samuel Delany's realist fiction, right? And so I'm thinking specifically of books like Equinox, Atlantis Model 1924, The Madman, Phallos, Dark Reflections, and Through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders. And I have not read The Atheist in the Attic. Once you have not read, so forgive me. So I have that here, but that might not actually fit. And so thinking about these works and thinking about, four, sort of came up with originally about six, but now I've boiled it down to four aspects of these works and of his realist fiction in general that I wanted to kind of focus on to talk about and sort of highlight how important he is. So, I mean, without question, he's one of the greatest science fiction writers we've seen. And he's also, I think, one of the major realist writers, right? He's a visionary innovator in terms of content and form. And I think we're still trying to catch up to the kinds of worlds he's depicted in his realist fiction, let alone his science fiction books, theoretical texts, comics, and his nonfiction. And as Tavia said, I'm going to say this again, the novels actually are, I think, in very important ways, works of theory in addition to being novels, important critical works. Central to that is the way that he has explored non-normative realities, and this is something that both Jayna and Tavia said. His discentering of our expectations of the world a novel will depict, particularly an American novel, a 20th and 21st century novel, and a novel by a Black and queer writer, as well as novels about Black queer people and LGBTQ people in general. One of the things I sort of noticed from the earliest of these works, and that you see this also in science fiction, is that he plays with and brings together, and this is something that has been a subject of debate in literary fictional discourse. It's not so controversial in 2021, but maybe we would say 10, 20 years ago, it was really a topic of a lot of discussion. The way that he sort of brings in all of these different genres and modes. So we can find in his work, the picaresque tale, pulp and pornographic fiction, historical and biographical modes, the philosophical novel, novel of ideas. And you see this, I think these come through increasingly in the science fiction novels, but especially in the realist novels, right? And I would say in certain cases with some of these components, we see this going all the way back to Equinox. The other thing too that I sort of have always been amazed by is his versatility as in terms of form, but also style. And I would actually suggest, it's interesting when you mentioned the term para. I had this, I sort of was trying to think about, how to describe his realism. And so one way, of course, thinking about it is a kind of fantastic realism to a certain degree. Another one I was saying, and this, forgive me for citing Roberto Bolaño's term, because it's a completely different meaning of it. But infrarealism, right? Because he sort of gets deep within the real. And also pararealism, right? So how do you depict the real outside the usual realities we see? So I think that in all these works we see components of each of those. I think if we go back to Equinox, it's essentially a realist novel with fantastical elements. So of course it would be each of these things that I said. But one of the things I was sort of thinking about and looking at that book was that, I'm sorry, I've got a cat showing his head here. And thinking about that work is how I mean, there are probably places on this earth where one could find the things that he depicts happening to that black sea captain, right? So it wouldn't be too, wouldn't be fantastical, except that we usually don't see these things depicted. So in a sense, right, it does feel almost fantastical, even though it is sort of situated within a kind of realist frame. In a text like Dark Reflections, which is one of my favorite of his books, it's as much novel about the writing life. So here we have the kind of meta realist component, literary history, academe, reputation. We have a cat friend who wants to make an appearance, as it is about the specific characters. And one of the things I was thinking about this novel is, and I think I remember Tip, you saying this, was that, I mean, the even just having the novel unfold in reverse was a significant thing. I mean, but of course, even in so doing, you do very innovative things in terms of temporality and plot, and you have a kind of associative, narrative ligaments that connect those sections, right? That reward rereading, because I think every time you reread that book, you learn something new about how he's actually putting that story together and how he puts stories together. And so just a few other things I was thinking about in terms of the formal play. He's given us a novella within a novella, right? Think of Phallus. You've given us prose text that is so interwoven with poetry by real and imagined writers, right? The one that's been just, like an entire text, right? Or essay, article, even, sections of a longer book, teasing out the intertextual references. You've given us a quasi-epic that turns that genre on its head. And this is a really sort of remarkable book. And you also give us something I have to say I'd never seen before this novel, but and I have rarely seen it since. A novel that ends with a scholarly article, this is a remarkable book, explicating HIV transmission routes, right? And then, of course, you also have things that really sort of interesting sort of figures that appear and reappear. So I think about that kind of bull-like figure, the centauric figure that reoccurs across different works, and kind of recurs. Another thing I wanted to point out was how one of the ways to think about your realist works and all of your works, right, but especially these realist works, is as a kind of epistemological fiction, right? So in each of these works, they are interested in and function as forms of epistemological inquiry, right? So to put it another way, when I read your fiction, right, and here I'm going to focus specifically, as I said, on the realist text, I see them engaging in a process of making and trying to understand how knowledge is produced, right? And so this again brings us back to what Tavia was saying about the works of fiction themselves being theoretical and critical. And you to return to something Jayna was saying, how you're interested in language itself, but this question of knowing and understanding what to know might mean when explored from different premises than we usually understand in and through the complexities of each work's narratives. So these are novels full of ideas. They're novels that are full of ideas that interrogate those ideas, but without the rigidity or narrative sterility of some traditional and conventional idea novels or novels of ideas. So I think it's significant that the protagonist of The Madman, right, John Marr, is a philosophy graduate student whose research leaves the realm of, the text and the archive, right, for the street, and then becomes, kind of exploration all its own, right? Another model for what research might look like. In Atlantis Model 2024, you're essentially telling the story of your father's arrival in New York. It's also essentially an immigrant story, but also a great migration story, which is also a mini biography. But it's also a story about Hart Crane and Kendall Greenberg and New York of the Jazz Age, colored by race, class, sexuality, and it delves into questions not only of experience, but of knowledge itself. So the text raises questions about how language functions, how it does so, what it can express or not, and of course also magic, I mean, African magic, right? And so on, even as both showing and telling us about the world it's portraying. The richness, strangeness, and complexity of this novella has to be experienced and fully grasped, I think, what I'm saying. And then to pick just another text, Through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders, it's an epic work, as I was saying. This is much about a search for knowledge, and through the social, the corporeal, the intellectual, as it is about specific plotted narrative it portrays. It's thrilling, disturbing, disorienting, unnerving, to some I'm sure horrifying, and ultimately, I think this is really kind of significant, sublime. It's just a sublime novel, right? That in a sense shows us what another kind of representation of the sublime might look like in and through narrative. What does it mean, among the various questions it raises, to live and love in these ways, right? To be and thrive as such, when to be and live as such, is to place oneself at and beyond, in a radical way, the limits of society, of societies as we know it and know them. So I think this is a fundamental question that we were saying gay liberation and later LGBTQ and queer studies has taken up, have taken up in a variety of ways. But here is, you know, we see these questions raised and depicted, embodied, right, as a philosophical novel, but shorn of the guideposts, constraints of that genre, as you're working through the possibilities. So I said this is epistemological without being an exercise, so it does work the mind and imagination out to the nth degree. Another thing that I think is very significant is your very distinctive, really kind of unmatched depictions of Black, gay, and LGBTQ characters and their subjectivities. And I think Tavia and Jayna both were talking about this to a certain degree. When I first started reading you, one of the reasons was because you were, I was told by my fellow Darkroom collective members, and I think Teacher Brian and I went to see you read at MIT, and we were kind of astonished. I was like, who is this person? He's real. He's not just a figment of someone's imagination. An out Black gay man writing science fiction that deals and dealt openly with issues of race, gender, class, sexuality, and so on in pathways of ways. And so I would say that in thinking of your realist fiction, right, one of the areas that I have frequently thought about and learned from is your depiction of your LGBTQ characters in general, and in specific your these Black gay characters, right? Their distinctiveness really has few parallels in literature. I don't think I have ever encountered a character like John Marr. And I'm thinking specifically both of the specificities of his characterization, but also in terms of the world in which you immerse him in, right? And so it's fascinating to sort of think about this in relation to your nonfiction, both your sort of autobiographical works and your theoretical works, like Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, and to sort of think about how, as both as fiction and in the nonfictional and critical and scholarly ways that you have kind of thought through possibilities of new possibilities of ways of being as a Black gay person, right, and Black queer personhood in this fiction. And I would say the same is true of someone like Arnold Hawley, right? Hawley, the protagonist of Dark Reflections, who's a repressed, essentially failed Black gay poet. Who else has imagined a character like this, right? Even though I think this person does exist, I won't name the names, but I mean, it's sort of fascinating to see this character in fiction. And so I think we can go through any number of these works, both the science fictional ones and the more realist ones, and to just imagine how these characters really are groundbreaking in so many ways. And I would say even it's not just the Black characters. I mean, because thinking about someone like Timothy Hasler or Randy Peterson in Phallus, right? Or this panoply of characters in Through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders, right? These are not characters that we have seen depicted frequently, right? So I think it kind of opens up the space for those of us who are, coming after you to continue to think through new possibilities. The last thing I'll say, and I'll wrap up here, is just one of the things that I find remarkable is the way that you have written new ethical possibilities of queer relationships, right? And I'll sort of end by noting that I think you took up very early on one of the range of concepts that people like the radical lesbians, Audre Lorde in certain ways, Michel Foucault and others advanced during gay liberation and its aftermath, which was thinking through, imagining, and writing in addition to embodying new ways of living and loving, right? So again and again and again across your works, and specifically in these realist texts, which I'm focusing on here, we see you trying to think through what queer, non-normative relationships that rest upon different kinds of exchanges, mutualities, heterogeneities, acknowledgements and embracements without erasures of difference and hierarchies of social, political, economic, and cultural forms of power, excess, waste, surplus, objections, and so on might look like. How do we treat, live with, befriend, love, have sex with, separate from, renew our links to others, especially if our lives and desires do not fall within what is considered acceptable, mainstream, normative? How do we think about and live with ourselves under such circumstances? So I would say, such efforts are always challenging, right? Even terrifying, especially if we move away from what used to be called, I think, bourgeois heteronorms, which have reconstituted themselves in neoliberal capitalism as various forms of homonormativities and, the risk of sounding utterly oxymoronic, queer normativities, right? Again and again, I think, in your work, we see what kinds of relationships, what new kinds of relationships, different kinds of relationships might look like, however provisional or extended. And we can also derive, I think, an ethics from them in relation to the other and to others. So I'll stop there.
Thank you all so much. Wow, so much to think about and chew on. We are kind of getting close to the hour, so we're going to move right to Samuel's reading, and we'll probably just take like one question at the end. So if you think of a question while you're listening, go ahead and add that in the Q&A, but that's okay if you don't, and we will just all enjoy a fabulous reading by the man himself. Chip, go ahead.
Okay. Well, first I have to say thank you to everyone. The greatest gift I think any writer can get is intelligent attention, and that's what I've been treated to this evening. So I simply have to thank you all for that. I have a recent book, and because writers are who we are, I'm going to read you a little part from it. It's not fiction. It's a set of essays, and it has one essay that's fairly long, and it's called Beatitudes, and it's rather historical, but it does reflect on some of the things that went into what Tavia was talking about, and what it does. At one point, I realized that from time to time, I have run into, especially in my early years, I ran into the various writers and who were associated with the Beat generation. And I thought, well, let me just go over them all and write about the encounters I had. It was not something I ever felt. I felt it was my generation, but I didn't feel I was a part of it, if you know what I mean. That's a strange thing. One of the writers who's not included in this collection, Beatitudes, which includes people like Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs and Helen Adam and a number of others, Freddie Herco and what have you, and is a meeting I had with Gregory Corso at one point, and only fairly recently, like less than a month ago, I wrote a Facebook post about it. And so this is basically a sort of slightly revised version of the Facebook post that I wrote, meeting Gregory Corso. The most important thing that happened to me literarily on my first 6-month European trip is that one afternoon, possibly in mid-March, I will never know for sure, though it may be recorded in Alan Anson's journals, is in a Cathenion at the foot of the Athenian Plaka, at a crowded table under sunlight and a shady tree, where we English speakers were talking about Euripides. I got invited suddenly and rather surprisingly to lunch at Alan Anson's Koloniki apartment by Gregory Corso. Both Anson and Corso were at the table, and I knew perhaps 2 others of the 8 of us sitting around. "Hey, this guy looks interesting," Corso said, turning to me. "Let's ask him along." So Anson said, "Sure," and gave me his address. There followed a weird afternoon running all over Athens with Gregory while he explained he was researching a version of the Bacchae. "This is a classic, and you can't fuck around with classics," which, as far as I knew, he never finished. 1 or 2 days later, I turned up at Anson's, which had some original Cocteau drawings framed on the walls. In a peasant-style kitchen, over a failed stew that Gregory had cooked and wouldn't eat, he'd misjudged the heat of the peppers, though I thought it was okay, and Anson and I both had a bowl. I'd brought a bottle of Retsina, but there was already some white wine, which we all drank. "Hey, really," Greg said, "you guys don't have to eat this shit." But I thought it, as I said, I thought it was fine. One of them asked what I was writing about, and I explained the topic of my new novel I was working on, back then called A Fabulous Formless Darkness. There, Greg made the remark about my project now known as the Einstein Intersection, recorded on page 101 of the published book. Jean Harlow, Christ, Orpheus, Billy the Kid, those 3 I can understand, but what's a young spade writer like you doing all caught up with a great white bitch? Of course, I guess it's pretty obvious. Greg had recognized me as Black, and the great white bitch was Harlow herself, which was not the way I'd have described her, but I knew what he meant. Back in the States, weeks after the Einstein Intersection appeared, I ran into a strung out Gregory sitting on some Lower East Side steps, probably waiting for drugs. I don't think he remembered me, but I told him I get him a copy of the Einstein Intersection with my comment. "I'll be back," I told him, "in 7 minutes, 5 o'clock. Will you be here?" "Man," he said, "I ain't going nowhere." And I was, with one of my 6 author's copies with the original Jack Donn cover. But probably by that time, his connection had shown up and he was gone. I never saw him again. In 1968, Damon Knight told me he thought the Einstein intersection was stronger than Babel 17. And that year, quite to my surprise, both it and my Dangerous Vision story, Babel, I and Gomorrah, took Nebula Awards. Unlike the previous year, those running the banquet were fans and had not told the winners we'd won, which was a big mistake. The original title is still memorialized on the first epigraph on page 131. In pity for man's darkling thought, he walked that room and issued thence in Galilean turbulence. The Babylonian starlight brought a fabulous, formless darkness in. From William Butler Yeats, 2 songs from a play. It's the same page that has a quotation from one of the letters by Billy the Kid to Lieutenant Governor Lew Wallace, the author of the 1880 biblical blockbuster novel Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. Dawn, by the way, had already apologized to me for the cover, and 3 years later, for a reprint, did a much better one, which we both agreed was more appropriate. Beatitudes, section 8. George Preston was a Black artist and a decent banjo player who, when he'd been 18 or 19, had been my counselor at Camp Woodland. For several years in my early middle 20s, when I would be standing in line waiting for a teller in those days before ATMs at the manufacturer's Hanover Trust Bank on the corner of 8th Street and 6th Avenue, regularly I ran into him wearing his jeans and blue denim jacket. Invariably, I was coming from my agent's office on 10th Street, just off 6th Avenue. We'd exchanged 3 minutes of pleasantries. George was doing well. I was doing well. He was having a show. I had a new book. A year or two older than I, a short young albino with thick glasses before the palest of eyes, another woodland camper, worked at the news kiosk just outside the bank. We all said hello when we passed each other, George, myself, and the young man whose name I no longer recall. Along with Seymour Krim, whom I later met through Judith Merrill, artist Al Hansen, who visited me a couple of times on East 6th Street with my friend Anna and had tea, and Richard Seaver, whom I'd lunched with once when he was briefly interested in a novel of mine during his tenure at Grove Press. George shows up now and again at parties or gatherings photographed and reprinted in collections devoted to the Beats as part of its almost endless cast of what Jill Johnson has chronicled so brilliantly as minor characters. What those pictures tell me today is that I was a little too young, a little too bumptious, and just not social enough at the time to have yet wandered into that particular circle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chip. It's fabulous to hear you reading and to hear you reading your new stuff. I think we've been tasked with, we get to spend a few moments talking with you before Melanie comes back in.
Thank you so much for that, Chip.
Yeah.
You're most welcome. As I said, the book is called Occasional Views, and it's this kind of the first volume of a kind of sweep up collection of essays. These are the old ones that were never published. Most of them were never published. And then there will be a second volume in September of the newer work.
And you are already working on more volumes, if the Facebook posts are any indication.
Yeah, well, that's an idea that I'm actually working on, maybe collecting a handful of them and seeing what they. I try to do one a day at least, and sometimes I do seven. I do lots of pictures of oatmeal. Because that seems to be the major thing we eat nowadays. Every morning, that's breakfast.
There could be your form of that. I think the Brazilian form, the chronicas, right? You know, the daily,
yes.
chronicles. They're wonderful. They're wonderful.
The first time I heard you read, since you mentioned Camp Woodland, you read from, I was in college, and you came and you read from The Motion of Light and Water, and the reading was about your camp counselor, who is also known as Doré.
Mary Davis, who was part of the Jewel Box Review. She's a wonderful person, very, very supportive of me. My favorite camp counselor when I was there, and when I discovered when I was 17 and I snuck off to see the Jewel Box and didn't want anybody to know. And then got back to my families, and a couple of months later, and then then my uncle said that he had been with his wife, and it was the greatest night he'd ever had. My uncle, the judge, great Catholic judge, going on about how wonderful the Jewel Box review was. And then I discovered later, in fact, I discovered later on that it was that I actually knew one of the performers, which was quite an astonishment. Yes. So that is how that's that story. Oh, thank you. I see Melanie was holding up the motion of light and water, which is
Yes, this is how I'm going to spend my summer vacation. So
It's riveting, absolutely riveting. Yeah.
I'm so thrilled to have heard everybody. Chip, thank you so much for that brilliant reading.
Thank you all for your comments and what have you. Very warming to hear.
I hope you all have a fabulous summer. Happy Pride, happy Juneteenth, and happy reading. And hopefully we'll meet all together in the real world at the Center for Fiction someday. It's a beautiful space. And we'll continue the conversation. Until then, good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.